I've decided to start a new life without you." The words hung in the air of Riverwood Inn's grand ballroom, suspended amid crystal chandeliers and the heady scent of fresh lily that adorned each elegantly set table. My husband of 28 years, Richard, stood with his champagne glass, still raised his announcement displacing the toast he was supposed to be making to our daughter's academic achievements. His silver-streaked hair caught the light as he swayed slightly already. 3 glasses into the celebration before it had properly begun, the clinking of silverware against fine china ceased. Conversations halted mid-sentence, leaving only the faint strains of classical music from the string quartet in the corner. 50 pairs of eyes darted between Richard and me, waiting for my reaction. For the tears, the shouting, the dramatic exit everyone expected from the wronged wife. Instead, I smiled my fingers steady around the stem of my untouched champagne flute. "Congratulations on your honesty." My voice carried across the suddenly silent room, clear and composed. "My name is Victoria Reynolds. I am 54 years old, and until this moment I had been playing the role of the devoted wife and mother perfectly. I put my own career aspirations on hold to support Richard through 3 business ventures, 2 career changes, and countless finding himself phases that had grown more frequent and expensive as middle age tightened its grip on him. I raised our brilliant daughter, Sophia, who sat beside me now, her graduation cap still perched on her copper-brown hair, her expression frozen in horror beneath the tassel that swung with her sharp intake of breath. From the corner of my eye, I could see Natalie Parker, Richard's much younger girlfriend, shifting uncomfortably at a table near the back of the room. Her emerald dress too formal for a graduation luncheon, too revealing for polite company, marked her as an outsider, despite her attempts to blend in. She sat among people I had considered friends for decades, neighbors from our Somerville historic district, colleagues from Richard's architectural firm, parents of Sophia's childhood friends, the same friends who apparently knew about the affair but never thought to tell me their silence, a betrayal nearly as cutting as my husband's infidelity. The same Natalie who had attended our Christmas parties as the new marketing director at Richard's firm, who had once called me for advice about navigating Augusta's competitive business landscape, who had looked me in the eye while carrying on with my husband behind my back. With practiced calm refined through years of hosting charity galas and weathering Richard's professional disappointments, I reached into my Salvatore Ferragamo handbag, a gift from Richard on our 25th anniversary, back when appearances still mattered to him, and pulled out a sealed cream-colored envelope. I placed it gently beside Richard's plate, the heavy cardstock making a soft sound against the damask tablecloth. "What's this?" he asked, his triumphant expression faltering, crow's feet deepening around eyes that had once looked at me with something akin to adoration. "Something for you to read later," I replied, keeping my voice steady. Years of Southern upbringing, ensuring my composure remained intact even as my world imploded in public. I turned to Sophia, whose face had gone pale beneath her summer-tan freckles. Standing out in stark relief, I kissed her cheek, catching the scent of the Jo Malone perfume I'd given her that morning. "I am so proud of you, sweetheart. This day is still about your accomplishment." Then I smoothed the linen of my pale blue dress, chosen to complement Sophia's school colors, rather than to flatter my own coloring, and addressed our stunned guests, people who had witnessed our marriage through decades of Augusta social seasons. "Please enjoy your meal. The duck confit is particularly good at Riverwood. I wish you all a lovely afternoon." With that masterpiece of Southern understatement, I walked out of the restaurant, my head held high, feeling 50 pairs of eyes following me as my heels clicked a steady rhythm across the marble floor. The heavy oak door swung shut behind me, cutting off the beginning of anxious murmurs that rippled through the gathering like wind across the Savannah River. Outside, the Augusta summer heat hit me like a wall, the humidity instantly dampening the careful blowout I'd gotten that morning in preparation for what should have been a day of maternal pride. But I welcomed the oppressive warmth, the physical discomfort distracting from the ice forming around my heart. For the first time in years, I could breathe freely, no longer maintaining the facade of marital contentment that had become increasingly difficult to sustain. Behind me, I heard the restaurant door open and slam shut, followed by Richard's voice, no longer confident and self-congratulatory, but high-pitched and frantic. "Victoria, what the hell is this? What have you done?" His leather loafers slapped against the pavement as he hurried after me. Waving the now opened envelope with its contents partially exposed, I kept walking toward the parking lot, allowing myself a small smile that contained no mirth, only grim satisfaction. The envelope I'd handed him contained the beginning of my revenge, one I'd been meticulously planning for months, with the same attention to detail that had once made me indispensable to Richard's career and social ambitions. "Victoria, stop this instant and explain yourself." Richard's command held the expectation of obedience that had characterized our marriage for too long. I continued toward my car, a modest Volvo I'd chosen for safety, rather than statement, unlike Richard's midlife crisis Porsche, that gleamed 2 spaces over its convertible top down. Despite the gathering clouds that threatened afternoon thunderstorms, I unlocked my car with a press of the key fob, the lights flashing once in acknowledgement. As I opened the driver's door, Richard caught up his breath, coming in short gasps from the brief exertion in the crushing heat. "Did you really think I wouldn't find out?" I asked, finally turning to face him. Up close, I could see the toll recent months had taken new lines etched around his mouth, the slight softening beneath his jaw that his expensive grooming routine couldn't quite disguise. "Did you really think I was that oblivious, Richard?" He clutched the envelope to his knuckles white against the cream paper. "These documents, these accusations, they're preposterous." His voice cracked with indignation or fear. It was hard to tell which. "You've been planning this for months, while pretending everything was normal. How could you be so calculating?" The irony of his accusation nearly made me laugh. I had always been the practical one in our marriage. While Richard dreamed big and took risks, I maintained the stability our family needed. I was the one who saved for Sophia's education when Richard invested unwisely in his college roommate's restaurant venture, losing $60,000 in 6 months. I was the one who worked extra hours as a senior finance manager at Truvanta Corporation when his midlife crisis led him to quit his stable position at Henderson and Associates to follow his passion for boutique architectural concepts, a passion that lasted approximately 6 months before he grew bored and moved on to his next great idea. My own dreams, opening a financial consultancy for women, were perpetually on hold. After Sophia graduates, I told myself, after Richard finds stability, always after, never now. Always his needs before mine, his crises taking precedence over my aspirations. I learned from the best. I replied, sliding into the driver's seat and closing the door with deliberate care. The luxury of air conditioning enveloped me as I started the engine, rolling down the window, just enough to make my final point. "Enjoy explaining to our guests why you're standing in the parking lot, rather than hosting your daughter's graduation luncheon. I'm sure Natalie can help you craft a narrative. She is in marketing, after all. I drove away, leaving Richard standing beside his impractical sports car, the envelope clutched in his hand, his mouth open, but no sound emerging. In my rearview mirror, I could see Sophia rushing from the restaurant. Her graduation cap abandoned her face, a mixture of hurt and confusion. I hated leaving her there, but this moment had been inevitable since I discovered the truth 3 months ago. Better a clean break in a public place than a messy, private confrontation where Richard could manipulate the narrative unchallenged. 3 months ago, I had noticed discrepancies in our joint accounts. Small transfers to an account I didn't recognize. Having spent 20 years managing our family finances, while Richard focused on the big picture, these irregularities stood out like red flags against the careful budget I maintained. I could have confronted Richard immediately, but something held me back. Perhaps it was intuition honed through years of managing his impulsive financial decisions. Or perhaps it was the growing distance between us over the past year, the late nights at the office, the sudden business trips to Charleston and Savannah, the new cologne that replaced the Acqua di Parma I gave him every Christmas. Instead of confrontation, I began quietly investigating. I started with the bank records tracing the transfers to an account at South Trust Bank, an institution where we had no existing relationship. Then I checked our credit card statements, finding charges for restaurants. I'd never visited jewelry from a boutique in Charleston hotel rooms in Hilton Head on weekends when Richard had claimed to be meeting clients in Atlanta. What I discovered was worse than I imagined. Richard had been systematically moving funds to a separate account for over a year, building a nest egg separate from our shared assets. He had also been taking Natalie to expensive restaurants, purchasing jewelry, a particular bracelet from Krogan's Jewel Box in Charleston that cost more than Sophia's semester tuition, and looking at beachfront property on Hilton Head Island, all while telling me we needed to tighten our belts for retirement. The market's been unpredictable. He'd said last Christmas when I suggested we take Sophia to Europe after her graduation, as we had always planned, we need to be cautious with discretionary spending this year. This from the man who had just put a $5,000 deposit on a beach cottage to share with his mistress. Then came the text messages I discovered when Richard left his phone unlocked on the kitchen counter while showering. Messages about their new life together. Messages about how he was finally breaking free. Messages about their plans for the day after Sophia's graduation. The day he had chosen to make his grand exit from our marriage. "Can't wait to see their faces when I make the announcement," he texted Natalie. "Victoria is so controlled, she'll probably just smile and pretend it's all fine. Always the perfect hostess." He knew me well enough to predict my public reaction, but not well enough to anticipate that I would be 3 steps ahead of his grand gesture. What Richard had forgotten, or perhaps never fully grasped, was that I had been a financial professional for 30 years. Before scaling back to support his career and raise Sophia, I had been on track to become CFO at Truvanta. I understood money trails, I knew how to trace assets. And most importantly, I remembered the prenuptial agreement we had signed 28 years ago, when my family's old timber money still outweighed his promising but unproven career potential. The agreement he had insisted upon, ironically, to protect his future earnings from my family's potential claims, contained a fidelity clause that would prove to be his undoing. A clause his father owed money from Savannah, with a healthy distrust of fortune hunters, had included, despite Richard's protests that it was unnecessary. Victoria would never be so calculating. He'd assured his father he had been wrong about that too. While Richard plotted his escape with Natalie, I was building my case. I consulted with attorney Martin Goldstein, Augusta's most discreet and effective divorce lawyer. I documented every hidden transfer. I gathered evidence of the affair. Credit card receipts, hotel confirmations, photographs. From the private investigator I hired after finding the text messages, I prepared divorce papers with a thoroughness that would have impressed my former colleagues at Truvanta. I timed everything perfectly, knowing Richard would want to wait until after Sophia's graduation to avoid ruining her big day, his sense of propriety extending that far, at least. What he didn't expect was that I would serve the divorce papers that very morning, filing them with the court at 8 a.m. before joining the family for Sophia's 10 a.m. commencement ceremony. But with the papers still safely hidden in court records not yet accessible to him, what Richard didn't know was that I was always 3 steps ahead, anticipating his moves with the precision that had once made us such effective partners. I didn't return to the restaurant. Instead, I drove to our home, a spacious Greek revival in Augusta's historic Somerville district that we had purchased 15 years ago when Richard's career was at its peak and my family connections had secured the off-market deal. The house that Richard had already promised to Natalie, according to text messages that he didn't realize I had seen. "You'll love the garden." He'd written, "Victoria has put so much work into it, but you'll make it your own." The thought of Natalie replanting my carefully cultivated heirloom, roses with whatever passed for gardening in her Pinterest-inspired imagination, made my blood boil more than any of the romantic messages ever could. I parked in the circular driveway and calmly entered what had been our shared space for over a decade. Everything looked the same, the family photos in silver frames on the entryway table, the antique grandfather clock that had been my father's wedding gift to us, the worn leather Chesterfield sofa where Richard and I had once dreamed of our future together. Yet everything had changed, as if the air itself had been replaced with something thinner, less sustaining. The house was quiet save for the ticking of the grandfather clock and the soft hum of the central air conditioning, a battling against the Georgia heat, a move through the familiar rooms, with new eyes seeing not our shared history, but the battlefield for the coming divorce. The antiques from my family, the art we'd collected together, the renovation projects that had consumed weekends and stretched our budget, all now, pieces to be divided assets, to be cataloged and valued. I went upstairs to the master bedroom and opened Richard's closet, curious if he'd already begun preparing for his departure. His clothing was neatly arranged, as always. Richard had always been particular about his appearance, but now I noticed gaps in the usual order. Several suits were missing, along with his favorite casual wear. In the back, 2 large suitcases were packed and ready hidden behind winter coats that wouldn't be needed for months. I smiled at his predictability. He had always been meticulous about clothing and appearance, but careless about the important things like covering his digital tracks or understanding the legal implications of our prenuptial agreement. My phone buzzed incessantly with messages from friends at the restaurant, from Sophia, even from Richard's sister Eleanor, who had flown in from Seattle for the graduation. Eleanor, who had become more my friend than Richard's, over the years her academic career and unmarried status making her something of an oddity in Richard's traditional family, but a kindred spirit to me. I responded only to my daughter. "I'm okay. This isn't your burden to carry. Enjoy your graduation day as much as you can. We'll talk tonight. I love you more than anything." I had protected Sophia from the truth for months, not wanting to overshadow her final semester with family drama. She would be angry that I hadn't told her, but I knew she would understand eventually. Sophia had inherited my practicality, along with her father's charisma, a powerful combination that had helped her graduate summa cum laude from the University of Georgia's School of Journalism. I spent the next 3 hours methodically moving through the house, taking inventory with my phone camera, making notes about provenance of artwork and furniture, particularly items from my family. As a finance professional, I understood the importance of documentation. As a woman preparing for divorce, I understood the importance of evidence. Just as I finished photographing my grandmother's silver service in the dining room, I heard Richard's Porsche in the driveway, the engine's growl cutting through the afternoon, quiet like an announcement of war. The front door slammed open with enough force to rattle the crystal decanters on the bar cart in the living room. "Victoria!" He shouted, his voice echoing through the high-ceilinged hallway. "Where are you?" I was sitting in the living room, calmly reviewing documents on my laptop. I closed it as he stormed in his face, flushed with anger, or perhaps embarrassment. His blue linen shirt wrinkled and stained with what looked like wine near the collar. "What is the meaning of this?" he demanded, waving the papers from the envelope. "You served me with divorce papers today of all days, at our daughter's graduation celebration. I thought it aligned nicely with your plans." I replied calmly, setting my laptop aside and smoothing a wrinkle from my dress. "You wanted to start your new life. I'm simply helping facilitate the transition. You had no right." He paced before the fireplace, looking more like a petulant child than the distinguished architect he presented to the world. "I had every right." I interrupted, my voice steady, as I regarded the man I had once loved with all the passion my 26-year-old self could muster. "Just as you had every right to choose Natalie. We all make choices, Richard. Some are just more honest than others. The prenup expired years ago." He said, his voice suddenly smug, a familiar expression settling over his features. The look he got when he thought he'd found a loophole, a way to win. Despite the odds. Any lawyer will tell you that after 20 years of marriage, those agreements aren't worth the paper they're printed on. I allowed myself a small smile, the kind that never reached my eyes but served as a warning to those who knew me well. "Actually, it didn't. Section 12 specifically states that the fidelity clause remains in effect for the duration of the marriage, regardless of length. Your lawyer should have explained that to you when you signed it." I paused, watching realization dawn on his face. "Oh, wait, you didn't consult one, did you? You were too busy assuring your father that I would never be the type to hold you to such outdated concepts." The color drained from his face as reality sank in. The prenup he had insisted upon to protect his potential wealth from my family's influence would now cost him everything. The house in Somerville, the vacation property in Savannah's historic district, his portion of our retirement accounts, and the partnership share in his firm. His grand gesture at the restaurant had just become the most expensive announcement of his life. "You can't do this to me," Richard said, collapsing onto the Chesterfield, the leather creaking beneath his weight. "This was our life together. Yes, it was." I replied, standing to gain the psychological advantage of height. "A life you threw away for what Richard Youngerskin, the thrill of secrecy. The chance to start over with someone who doesn't know all your failures and false starts." Richard's phone buzzed persistently in his pocket. He glanced at it, then ignored it. Natalie no doubt wondering where he was and why he wasn't following their carefully orchestrated plan. The plan I had read in their text messages, where he would announce their relationship at the luncheon, weather the initial storm of family disapproval, then whisk her away to Hilton Head for a romantic weekend, while I was left to deal with the fallout. You've always been calculating, Victoria, but this is cold," he said, trying a different approach, his voice softening into the persuasive tone that had convinced countless clients to accept his architectural visions. "What about our history? 28 years together means nothing. The good times, the hard times, we weathered together. I studied him thoughtfully. This man I had loved for nearly 3 decades. The man who had held my hand through 2 miscarriages before we had Sophia, who had cried with me at my father's funeral, who had once surprised me with a weekend trip to Charleston for our 10th anniversary, complete with a private tour of historic homes led by a renowned preservationist who shared my passion for architectural history. When had he changed? Or had he always been this person, and I had been too devoted, too willing to see the best in him to notice? Our history meant everything to me. I answered truthfully, the first hint of emotion cracking through my carefully constructed facade. "That's why your betrayal hurt so deeply. Not just the affair, Richard, but the lies, the financial deception, the way you planned to humiliate me publicly, as if I hadn't given enough of myself to this marriage already." His expression softened momentarily, perhaps seeing an opening in my momentary vulnerability. "Then maybe we can fix this. I made a mistake. People make mistakes, Victoria. 28 years is too much to throw away over one bad judgment call." This wasn't a mistake, Richard. This wasn't a drunken indiscretion or a momentary lapse in judgment. This was a calculated plan spanning more than a year. You systematically moved our money. You looked at property with her. You planned your escape down to the last detail, including how to humiliate me in front of everyone. We know. I picked up my phone from the side table, opened the recording app, and played his own voice back to him. "After the graduation, I'll tell her it's over. A public setting is better. She won't make a scene in front of everyone." Then Natalie's voice, higher pitched and breathless with excitement. "And she has no idea about the money." Richard again confident and dismissive. "None, Victoria, trusts me completely. That's her weakness." The blood drained from Richard's face, leaving him ashen beneath his carefully maintained tan. "You recorded our conversations. That's illegal. Not in Georgia when one party consents." I responded, my years at Truvanta having taught me the importance of understanding relevant laws. "And not when it's in your own home. I didn't record your private moments with Natalie. I'm not voyeuristic or cruel. Just the conversations about your plans to defraud me financially." Richard stood suddenly agitated, running his hands through his silver-streaked hair in a gesture I had once found endearing. "I need to make some calls. This isn't over, Victoria." "Of course," I said, picking up my laptop and standing. "Your attorney might be a good start. I'll be staying at Eleanor's tonight. I've already packed a bag." "Eleanor's," he sputtered, his composure cracking further. "My sister's house." I nodded, a sense of satisfaction warming me at his obvious discomfort. "She's quite upset with you, actually. She was the one who first spotted you and Natalie together last Christmas at the Hendersons' party. She didn't tell me immediately she confronted you. First gave you a chance to end it honorably. You promised her it was nothing, that you would end it. When she realized you hadn't, she came to me. This was another blow he hadn't anticipated. Eleanor and I had always been close, kindred intellectual spirits who bonded over literature and art, while Richard talked business with her husband at family gatherings. But he never imagined his own sister would choose my side so decisively. Everyone's betraying me. he muttered, looking suddenly older than his 57 years. Ironic, isn't it? I gathered my purse and moved toward the entryway where my overnight bag waited by the door. You have until tomorrow evening to remove your things from the house. After that, the locks will be changed. And our finances? He asked, practical concerns finally breaking through his indignation. Frozen as of this morning. I replied, the court has issued a temporary restraining order, preventing either of us from making unusual withdrawals or transfers from joint accounts. Your personal account, the one at South Trust, remains accessible to you. Of course, as I headed toward the door, Richard called after me, desperation creeping into his voice. What about Sophia? Have you thought about how this affects her? How this public spectacle will impact her? I paused, anger finally breaking through my calm facade. I turned slowly to face him, letting him see, perhaps for the first time in years, the full force of my genuine emotion, rather than the measured responses I had trained myself to display. Don't you dare use our daughter as a shield, Richard! You certainly weren't thinking about her when you were planning your new beachfront life with Natalie. You weren't thinking about her when you decided to make your announcement at her graduation celebration instead of handling this privately, like an adult. You weren't thinking about anyone but yourself. His phone buzzed again. This time he looked at it and groaned, his shoulders slumping in defeat. Problem? I asked, unable to resist the small cruelty of the question. Natalie is at the apartment already. She's moved her things in. He looked confused, another piece of his carefully constructed plan, apparently falling apart. I couldn't help but smile this time, with genuine amusement. The apartment on Reynolds Street. The one you put in both your names. The lease you signed last month. Richard nodded, his expression wary, as he sensed another trap closing around him. You might want to check with the leasing office. That application was flagged for credit issues and never completed. The agent called our home phone to verify some information while you were in Savannah last week. I handled it myself. I walked out the door, leaving Richard to face the first of many consequences. His perfectly planned new life was unraveling faster than he could process the careful construction of lies and half-truths, collapsing like a house with faulty foundation, something Richard, as an architect, should have understood better than most. Eleanor lived in a charming Tudor-style home near Augusta University, where she taught comparative literature. When I arrived, she greeted me with a fierce hug that conveyed both sympathy and solidarity. Her angular frame, so similar to her brother's, enveloped me with surprising strength for a woman in her early 60s. I just heard from Sophia, she said, pulling me inside to the blessed cool of central air. Are you okay? Really okay. Not just Southern lady okay. I'm better than I expected, I admitted, following her to the kitchen where a bottle of Veuve Clicquot was already open, condensation beading on its golden surface. Eleanor had always believed that proper champagne was appropriate for any significant life event, positive or negative. I never thought Richard would make such a spectacle. Eleanor said, pouring 2 flutes with practiced precision. Her home reflected her personality books. Everywhere comfortable but elegant furniture art, collected during sabbaticals in Europe and Asia. No family photos, no domestic sentimentality, just the carefully curated space of a woman who answered to no one but herself. At the restaurant in front of everyone on Sophia's day, he's lost whatever sense he once possessed. It was meant to humiliate me. I explained, accepting the champagne and taking a grateful sip. The bubbles felt celebratory, despite the circumstances, or perhaps because of them, a toast to my liberation rather than my loss. A public rejection, so I couldn't fight back without looking hysterical. Richard always did understand the power of controlling the narrative. Eleanor's face darkened, the family resemblance to Richard momentarily visible in the set of her jaw. My brother always did have a flair for drama, but this is beyond anything I expected from him. This isn't just impulsiveness or midlife crisis. This is cruelty. We settled in her sunroom, surrounded by potted orchids and floor-to-ceiling bookshelves. Eleanor had never married, preferring her independence and academic pursuits to the compromises of partnership. Over the years, I had sometimes envied her freedom, especially during Richard's more difficult phases, when his ambitions outpaced his abilities, or his attention wandered to new projects before completing existing ones. "What did you put in that envelope that made him so upset?" she asked, adjusting her reading glasses that hung from a beaded chain around her neck, her only concession to aging. I explained the contents, the divorce filing with its detailed accounting of Richard's financial deceptions, the evidence of his affair meticulously documented by the private investigator, and most importantly, the prenuptial agreement with its fidelity clause, highlighted in yellow, ensuring he couldn't miss the implications. The prenup. Eleanor mused, a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. I remember when he insisted on it. Father was worried about fortune hunters, of course, but Richard was the one who really pushed for it. He was so concerned about protecting that seed money for his first architecture venture. She laughed, a sound like wind chimes in a gentle breeze. The irony is delicious. My phone rang Sophia's ringtone, a snippet from Brown-Eyed Girl that always made me smile. I took a deep breath before answering. "Mom," she said immediately, her voice strained but controlled so much like my own in crisis. "I'm coming over to Aunt Eleanor's." "Honey, you don't have to. This is still your day. Your friends planned that party at River Walk after the luncheon." "I'm already on my way." She interrupted, the sound of her car engine audible in the background. "Dad is telling everyone you've lost your mind, that you've been planning this for months. He's saying horrible things, Mom, about you, about your state of mind. Several people have already left the restaurant." Her voice caught. "He's trying to make you the villain." Of course he was. Richard always rewrote narratives to cast himself as the victim, the misunderstood creative genius, the man burdened by others' limitations. It was his most consistent quality, this ability to reshape reality to preserve his self-image. "Let him talk," I said, meeting Eleanor's concerned gaze across the sunroom. "The truth will become clear soon enough. The documents speak for themselves." 20 minutes later, Sophia arrived, still in her graduation dress, a lovely pale green that complemented her auburn hair, but with her makeup smudged from crying. She fell into my arms like she used to as a child, after a nightmare. Her slender frame shaking with emotion. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked, her voice muffled against my shoulder, smelling of the perfume I had given her, and the subtle scent of the mimosas served at the luncheon. "I would have understood. I wouldn't have let him blindside you like that. I didn't want to ruin your final semester." I explained, stroking her hair as I had when she was small. "You worked so hard for this day. I didn't want family drama to overshadow your achievement." She pulled back, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand, a gesture so reminiscent of her childhood self that my heart contracted. "Well, Dad took care of ruining it anyway." "You should have seen the restaurant after you left. Complete chaos." Natalie tried to follow Dad out, but he was already chasing after you. Then she just sat there, looking like she wanted to disappear. We moved to Eleanor's living room, where Sophia finally got the full story. How I had discovered the affair through financial discrepancies, the extent of Richard's duplicity with our money, and the detailed plans he and Natalie had made for their new life together. I knew something was off with Dad. Sophia admitted, curling her legs beneath her on Eleanor's cream-colored sofa. He's been different. Distracted, always on his phone, but I never imagined... She trailed off, shaking her head. I feel so stupid Natalie was at our house for dinner just last month, and I never suspected anything. None of us want to see these things in people we love. Eleanor said gently, bringing in a tray of tea and homemade lemon biscuits, stress baking being one of her few domestic inclinations. We see what we expect to see, what we want to see. My phone buzzed with a text message from Martin Goldstein. My attorney, the emergency filing had been approved by Judge Harriet Coleman, a no-nonsense jurist known for her intolerance of financial shenanigans in divorce cases. The accounts I had identified were frozen. Pending the divorce proceedings, Richard now had limited access to funds enough for living expenses, but not enough to follow through on the property purchases he had planned with Natalie. I showed the message to Eleanor and Sophia, a sense of grim satisfaction settling over me. The legal machinery, once set in motion, would grind inexorably toward justice, regardless of Richard's attempts to control the narrative. Good, Sophia said firmly, a hardness in her voice I had rarely heard before. He deserves it after what he did to you, after how long he's been lying to all of us. My daughter's loyalty warmed me, but I wasn't naive about the complications to come. He's still your father. I reminded her, reaching out to squeeze her hand. Your relationship with him is separate from what's happening between us. I won't put you in the middle, or ask you to choose sides. Sophia shook her head, copper highlights catching the late afternoon sun streaming through Eleanor's windows. Maybe someday, but right now I can't even look at him. He hugged me this morning and told me how proud he was, all while planning to blow up our family hours later. He used my graduation as a stage for his drama. Who does that? The doorbell rang, interrupting our conversation. Eleanor went to answer it, returning moments later with a troubled expression that instantly put me on alert. "It's Richard," she said, her voice tight with disapproval. And he's not alone. I steeled myself as Eleanor led Richard and Natalie into the living room. Natalie looked uncomfortable, shifting her weight from one stiletto-clad foot to the other, her eyes darting around Eleanor's academic sanctuary, as if searching for escape routes. She was 37, not exactly a trophy wife, but still 17 years my junior, with shoulder-length blonde hair, professionally highlighted to suggest natural sun-kissing, and the kind of confident posture that comes from years of Pilates and never having faced significant hardship. Richard, by contrast, looked furious. His earlier desperation hardened into righteous indignation. His tie was loosened, his hair disheveled, his complexion flushed in a way that highlighted the broken capillaries around his nose. Evidence of the Scotch habit that had increased in frequency over the past year. "Victoria, you need to stop this insanity." He demanded, his voice carrying the authoritative tone he used with junior architects who questioned his designs. "Unfreeze the accounts. We can discuss this like reasonable adults." Sophia stood up, placing herself slightly in front of me, in a protective gesture that touched me deeply. "Maybe you should have tried being reasonable before announcing to everyone at my graduation lunch that you were leaving, Mom." Richard's eyes widened, as if just noticing our daughter's presence. "Sophia, this doesn't involve you." This is between your mother and me. Doesn't involve me." She echoed incredulously, her voice rising with emotion. "You blew up our family on my graduation day, and it doesn't involve me. You used my celebration as a backdrop for your midlife drama, and it doesn't involve me." Natalie touched Richard's arm, her French manicured nails stark against his blue shirt. "Richard, maybe we should go." The sound of his first name on her lips, the casual intimacy of it, sent a wave of something not quite jealousy, but perhaps loss through me. She'd never called him Richard. In professional settings, always Mr. Reynolds. That small detail somehow made the betrayal more concrete than any credit card receipt or hotel booking. He shook her off with an irritated gesture. "No, I'm not leaving until Victoria agrees to be rational about this. These financial restrictions are completely unreasonable. I have business obligations, clients expecting progress on projects." Eleanor folded her arms across her chest, her academic's posture straightening to her full height. "My sister-in-law seems to be the only rational person in this scenario. You're the one who created this mess, Richard. The courts will sort out the finances in due time." I remained seated watching the drama unfold, with the detached interest of someone who had already processed her grief and moved to acceptance. For years, I had been the peacemaker in the Reynolds family, the one who smoothed over conflicts and kept everyone happy at holiday gatherings, the one who maintained relationships with Richard's difficult relatives, the one who made excuses for his absences at important events. That role was exhausting, and I had finally set it down like a burden I had carried long enough. The accounts will remain frozen until the preliminary hearing. I said calmly, my finance professional's voice taking over. "That's in 3 days. According to Martin Judge Coleman, we'll determine appropriate asset division and temporary support. At that time." 3 days! Richard sputtered, running his hand through his hair again in agitation. "What am I supposed to do for 3 days? I have meetings, commitments. You have your personal account." I reminded him, the edge in my voice barely perceptible to anyone who didn't know me well. "The one at South Trust Bank. The one you've been funneling money into for the past year. That should be sufficient for your immediate needs." Natalie's head whipped toward Richard, her professionally shaped eyebrows arching in surprise. "You have a separate account with how much in it?" An interesting dynamic was emerging between them, the cracks in their unified front already visible under the slightest pressure. Richard ignored her question, his focus entirely on me. "This is vindictive Victoria. This isn't like you. Perhaps you never really knew me." I replied, meeting his gaze steadily. "Just as I apparently never really knew you." Sophia turned to Natalie, her expression hardening in a way that reminded me of my own mother when faced with someone who had disappointed her deeply. "Did you know he was going to announce it like that at my graduation celebration?" Natalie had the decency to look ashamed, her carefully applied blush not quite concealing the flush spreading across her cheeks. I thought he was going to talk to your mother, privately, after the event. The announcement today was..." She hesitated, glancing at Richard. "Unexpected." Richard shot her a betrayed look, his jaw tightening visibly. Cracks were indeed forming in their alliance, hairline fractures that would likely widen under the pressure of financial reality and public scrutiny. "I think you both should leave," Eleanor said firmly, moving toward the front door with clear intent. "You've upset Sophia enough for one day, Sophia." Richard pleaded, stepping toward his daughter with one hand extended. "You understand that relationships change, don't you? Sometimes people grow apart. This isn't about you or even about your mother. Not really. It's about finding happiness before it's too late. My daughter's face hardened in a way I had never seen before. Her usual warmth replaced by something colder and more evaluative. What I understand is that you're a coward who couldn't even give Mom the dignity of a private conversation. What I understand is that you were stealing from our family while I was working 2 jobs to help pay for my textbooks, because you said money was tight. Richard paled his confident posture, faltering. That's not how it was. It's exactly how it was. Sophia cut him off, her voice steady despite the emotion evident in her eyes. Please leave, Dad. I can't look at you right now. The silence that followed was deafening, interrupted only by the ticking of Eleanor's antique mantel clock. Finally, Richard turned to go, Natalie trailing behind him like an afterthought, rather than the prize he'd sacrificed his marriage to claim. At the door, he paused and looked back at me, something like uncertainty flickering across his features. This isn't over, Victoria. I'll fight you on this. I met his gaze steadily. You're welcome to try. After they left, Sophia collapsed next to me on the sofa, tears streaming down her face. I've never talked to Dad like that. I wrapped my arm around her shoulders, feeling the slight tremble in her frame. Sometimes standing up for what's right is painful, but I'm proud of you for speaking your truth. I kissed the top of her head, breathing in the scent of her shampoo, the same brand she'd used since high school. A small constant in a rapidly changing landscape. Eleanor brought us fresh glasses of champagne, the bottle from earlier. Now tepid but still effervescent like our emotions, volatile but clarifying. 2 new beginnings, she said, raising her glass in a toast that felt more like a blessing. 2 new beginnings. Sophia and I echoed our glasses, meeting with a crystalline chime that seemed to herald not just an ending, but the opening of possibilities I had long set aside. This ending was just the beginning of something new. A life reclaimed, choices, unmade paths, not taken now, open before me. As I sipped the champagne, I felt lighter than I had in years, unburdened by the weight of maintaining appearances or subordinating my needs to Richard's ambitions. Whatever came next would be of my own choosing, on my own terms, for my own reason. For the first time in 28 years, the future belonged entirely to me. The preliminary hearing took place in a small courtroom on a rainy Tuesday morning, the kind of heavy Georgia downpour that turns streets into momentary rivers and sends humidity levels soaring. I arrived with Martin Goldstein, his distinguished silver hair and impeccable navy suit, marking him as Augusta's premier divorce attorney. Even before he opened his monogrammed briefcase, Richard came with a lawyer he had hastily retained, Jeffrey Palmer, a young associate from Harrington and Davis, a firm that specialized in corporate law, not family matters. Richard's poor choice of representation was yet another consequence of his rushed planning and financial limitations. Palmer looked uncomfortable in the wood-paneled courtroom, his commercial litigation experience clearly insufficient preparation for the emotional complexities of family court. Judge Harriet Coleman, an older woman with sharp eyes magnified by reading glasses, perched on the end of her nose, and no patience for dramatics, reviewed the prenuptial agreement with methodical attention to detail. Her chambers were austere compared to the ornate courtroom, outside the furnishings functional, rather than decorative, the only personal touch a series of framed photographs, showing her with various legal luminaries at conferences and events. This document appears to be in order, she said, looking over her reading glasses at Palmer. Do you contest its validity? The young lawyer cleared his throat, straightening papers before him that seemed to provide insufficient guidance for this moment. Your Honor, we believe the agreement has expired due to the length of time that has passed. Prenuptial agreements typically have limiting clauses or sunset provisions that Section 18 clearly states that the duration is for the term of the marriage, plus any legal proceedings resulting from its dissolution. Judge Coleman read aloud, her finger tracking the relevant passage with practiced precision. There is no expiration date indicated. She looked up, her expression suggesting she expected better preparation from counsel appearing in her courtroom. Did you review this document thoroughly before this hearing? Mr. Palmer. Richard leaned forward to whisper urgently to his lawyer, who looked increasingly uncomfortable as the judge's attention remained focused on him. Palmer adjusted his tie, a nervous gesture that betrayed his inexperience in this setting. Yes, Your Honor. However, we believe that certain provisions may be unenforceable under current Georgia law, particularly given the duration of the marriage and the commingling of assets over 28 years. Judge Coleman nodded a slight movement that suggested consideration rather than agreement. That may be an argument for trial, Mr. Palmer, but for purposes of this preliminary hearing. She turned another page in the document. Furthermore, the evidence of systematic fund transfers appears to violate the financial disclosure requirements in Section 23. She shuffled through the papers, making a note in the margin with a fountain pen that looked to be an expensive gift rather than standard judicial issue. I am ruling to maintain the freeze on joint accounts pending full financial discovery. Mr. Reynolds' personal account will remain accessible to him for reasonable living expenses, but no transfers exceeding $5,000 may be made without court approval. The family home will remain in Mrs. Reynolds' possession during proceedings as stipulated in the prenuptial agreement's infidelity clause. Richard's face flushed dark red, a vein pulsing visibly at his temple. This is outrageous. He muttered loud enough for me to hear across the small conference table. Palmer placed a restraining hand on his arm, but Richard shook it off with obvious irritation. Judge Coleman fixed him with a stern look, her decades on the bench having honed her ability to quell disruptions with a single glance. Mr. Reynolds, I suggest you review the agreement you signed more carefully and consider your options realistically. Outbursts in my courtroom will not be tolerated. She closed the file with finality. This court will reconvene in 30 days for the full hearing after discovery is complete. I expect full financial disclosure from both parties by then. As we left the judge's chambers, Richard caught up to me in the hallway, his expensive shoes squeaking slightly on the polished marble floor Palmer trailed behind, looking anxious. His briefcase clutched to his chest like a shield. Victoria, please. We need to talk about this reasonably. Richard's voice had lost its earlier anger, replaced by something approaching supplication. 28 years together has to count for something. We built a life, raised a daughter, weathered so much together. It counted for everything. I replied, conscious of Martin's protective presence beside me and the court officers watching discreetly from their stations. Until you decided it didn't. I met his gaze directly, letting him see not anger but resolve in my expression. Until you planned your exit with the precision of one of your architectural drawings, Richard. Until you decided that humiliating me publicly was an acceptable ending to nearly 3 decades together. Palmer stepped forward, his professional instincts apparently overriding his discomfort. Mrs. Reynolds, perhaps we could arrange a mediation session. Something less adversarial might benefit everyone. Martin placed a hand gently on my elbow, a silent reminder that engaging further served no purpose. Mrs. Reynolds has no interest in mediation at this time. He replied smoothly, "The court has made its ruling. We'll proceed according to the established timeline." I walked away, leaving Richard standing in the courthouse corridor beneath the grand dome with its painted scene of justice. The weight of his choices finally beginning to sink in. The marble echoed with our departing footsteps, the sound diminishing as we pushed through the heavy oak doors into the rain-washed day beyond. Word spread quickly through our social circle. Augusta's upper echelon being a surprisingly small world, despite the city's growth in recent years. Friends called daily, some offering support, others thinly disguising their curiosity as concern, all eager to hear my version of events after Richard's dramatic announcement. I maintained a dignified silence about the details, channeling the Southern reserve my mother had instilled in me from childhood. "Richard and I are separating. These things happen," became my standard response, delivered with a smile that discouraged further probing while maintaining social grace. Meanwhile, Richard's carefully constructed facade was crumbling faster than he could shore it up. The image he had cultivated, successful architect, devoted family man, pillar of Augusta society, was tarnished beyond easy repair. His firm, already facing challenges in a competitive market, suddenly found clients hesitant to commit to long-term projects with a principal whose stability was in question. The financial freeze imposed by Judge Coleman meant he couldn't follow through on promises made to Natalie. The beachfront property on Hilton Head they had been planning to purchase fell through when the earnest money wasn't delivered on schedule. The luxury car he had put a deposit on had to be returned to the dealership. The glamorous life he had painted for her in late-night texts and whispered promises was evaporating in the harsh light of financial reality. 2 weeks after the hearing, Eleanor called me, her voice tinged with amusement that she couldn't quite suppress, despite her general disapproval of taking pleasure in others' misfortunes. "Have you heard the latest? Natalie moved out already." I wasn't entirely surprised, having seen the cracks forming at Eleanor's house, but the speed was impressive. Nonetheless, I cradled the phone against my shoulder as I continued reviewing applications for the small office space I was considering downtown. What happened? Apparently, she discovered that Richard's business isn't doing as well as he claimed. The substantial savings he talked about don't exist, just the money he'd been siphoning from your joint accounts. Eleanor's voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper, despite her living alone. She told her friend Jennifer, you know, the one who works at that interior design firm, that she didn't sign up to date a man with financial problems. Jennifer told her cousin who plays tennis with my friend Margaret. The Augusta gossip network functioning with its usual efficiency. I couldn't help but laugh, the sound surprising me with its genuine mirth rather than bitterness. He always was good at creating illusions. It was what made him such an effective architect. In the early days, the ability to help clients see what could be, rather than what was, well, Natalie has apparently decided she prefers what is to what could be. Particularly when it comes to financial stability. Eleanor's voice grew more serious. How are you doing, really? Now that the initial shock has passed, I considered the question looking around the kitchen where I sat with my laptop and papers spread across the marble island Richard had insisted on during our renovation 5 years ago. I'm doing better than I expected. There are moments of sadness, of course, nostalgia for what was or what I thought was, but mostly I feel liberated. Good, Eleanor said firmly. It's about time. Meanwhile, I was rebuilding my life with the same methodical attention to detail that had made me an effective finance professional. The financial security I had always maintained, separate retirement accounts, investments from my family trust, that Richard had never been able to access the emergency funds I'd established years ago when his business first showed signs of volatility, gave me freedom he hadn't anticipated. I rented a small office space in a renovated cotton warehouse downtown, the exposed brick and original wooden beams, creating a warm, inviting atmosphere for the consultancy I had dreamed about. For years, Reynolds Financial Strategies for Women had a client list before the sign was even installed on the door. Word of mouth bringing women who had long trusted my advice, informally, and now could access my expertise professionally. My first clients were two women going through divorces of their own, both referred by Martin Goldstein, who recognized their need for financial guidance beyond legal counsel. Then came a widow struggling to understand investments her husband had managed exclusively throughout their 40-year marriage. A young professional seeking advice on buying her first home. Followed then a recently promoted executive negotiating a compensation package. Word of mouth brought more, each client's unique situation, reinforcing what I had suspected for years. Women needed financial advisors who understood their specific challenges, who spoke to them without condescension, who recognized that financial independence was about security rather than status or acquisition. Sophia, who had accepted a job with a digital marketing firm in Charleston, called me regularly. Our conversations evolving from her initial anger about the divorce to thoughtful discussions about relationships, independence, and building a life on one's own terms. "I'm so proud of you, Mom," she told me after I described my growing client list. "You're helping people during their worst moments, giving them tools to rebuild. That's extraordinary. I'm just doing what I wish someone had done for me earlier," I replied, settling into the window seat of my home office. Formerly our rarely used formal dining room, now transformed into a light-filled workspace, where I could review client files while watching the garden I'd cultivated for 15 years, preparing women for whatever might come, expected or unexpected, being needed for my expertise rather than my caregiving or social facilitation, was a novel and empowering experience. For so long, I had been defined by my relationships, Richard's wife, Sophia's mother, the perfect hostess for Richard's business, associates, the reliable volunteer for community organizations that enhanced our social standing. Now I was defining myself by my capabilities, my knowledge, my ability to guide others through challenging transitions. The final divorce hearing fell on what would have been our 29th anniversary, a coincidence that seemed fitting the date once marked for celebration, now signifying closure. Augusta's September humidity had finally broken the morning, clear and mild as I dressed for court in a tailored navy suit that conveyed authority without ostentation. Richard arrived looking haggard the month since Sophia's graduation, having taken a visible toll. I later learned that his firm was struggling without my financial support and guidance, several projects having fallen through when clients became aware of his personal and financial instability. Most of his junior architects had sought positions elsewhere, unwilling to tie their professional futures to a sinking partnership. Natalie was long gone, already, dating a cardiologist from Savannah. According to Eleanor's sources, most of our mutual friends had distanced themselves from Richard after learning the full story of his deception. Augusta's society being generally forgiving of discreet indiscretions, but less tolerant of public humiliation and financial impropriety. Judge Coleman upheld the prenuptial agreement in its entirety, Despite Palmer's half-hearted arguments about changed circumstances and unconscionability, Richard left with his personal possessions, his struggling business, and the money in his private account, which after legal fees and months of living expenses was barely enough to secure a small apartment in a complex on Augusta's west side, far from the historic district where we had entertained colleagues and clients in our carefully restored Greek revival. I retained our home, my retirement accounts, and 70% of our joint investments, exactly as the prenuptial agreement stipulated in cases of infidelity. The justice was poetic in its symmetry. The very document Richard had insisted upon to protect himself from my family's potential claims had become his downfall. The legal shield he'd created to guard his ambitions now defending me from his betrayal. As we left the courtroom, Richard approached me one last time. His shoulders slumped beneath his suit jacket that hung looser than it had in June. Martin had stepped away to speak with the court clerk, leaving us momentarily alone in the marble hallway where sunlight streamed through tall windows, catching dust motes in golden suspension. "I made a terrible mistake," Richard said quietly, his voice lacking its usual resonance. "Is there any chance we could—" He trailed off, perhaps seeing the answer in my expression before I could voice it. "No!" I interrupted, gentle but firm, the way I'd once refused Sophia's childhood requests for second desserts or extended curfews. "That door is closed. Richard?" He nodded resignation, replacing the hopeful look that had briefly animated his features. "I understand," and for once I believed he did. The Richard I had married, charming, ambitious, self-assured to the point of arrogance, had been replaced by someone who finally comprehended the consequences of his actions. "I hope you find happiness, Victoria. You deserve it." It was perhaps the first truly selfless thing he had said to me. In years, the first statement that wasn't calculated to advance his interests or maintain his preferred narrative. I studied him for a moment. This man I had loved, built a life with, supported through countless ventures and reinventions. There was gray in his hair I hadn't noticed before. New lines around his mouth, a weariness in his posture that made him look older than his 57 years. "Thank you, Richard. I wish the same for you." I meant it, surprising myself with the realization that, beneath the hurt and anger, I still cared what happened to him, if only for Sophia's sake and for the memory of the man he had been when we first met the passionate young architect, with dreams of creating spaces that would outlive us both. We parted without further drama, the closing of a chapter that had occupied nearly 3 decades of my life. As I walked to my car, Martin falling into step beside me, with a respectful silence that acknowledged the moment's wait. I felt a curious lightness, as if I had set down a burden I'd been carrying for so long. I'd forgotten it wasn't part of me. 6 months later, my consultancy, Reynolds Financial Strategies for Women, was thriving beyond my initial projections. I had moved from the small office to a larger space in the same renovated warehouse, adding a conference room for workshops and hiring 2 associates, both women with financial backgrounds who shared my vision for empowering female clients. I specialized in helping women secure their financial futures through major life transitions, whether planned or unexpected. Divorce, widowhood, career changes, retirement planning. All moments when financial confidence became particularly crucial and traditionally underserved in an industry that often focused on male clients and wealth accumulation rather than security and life planning. Sophia visited, often proud of what I had built and considering a move back to Augusta to join a growing digital marketing agency that served many of the same clients as my firm. Our relationship had deepened through the divorce process, evolving from mother-daughter dynamics to something approaching friendship between adult women who respected each other's choices and wisdom. "You know what's ironic?" she said during one visit, curled in one of the comfortable armchairs I'd placed in my office, specifically for longer client consultations. "If Dad had just been honest from the beginning, if he'd asked for a divorce like a reasonable person, instead of plotting behind your back, he might have kept half of everything. Sometimes people can't see beyond what they want in the moment." I replied, pouring us both tea from the antique silver service that had once been my grandmother's, now proudly displayed in my office, rather than hidden in a cabinet, as Richard had preferred. "They focus on the goal rather than the path, the destination rather than the journey. Very philosophical, Mom." Sophia teased, though her expression remained thoughtful. "But you're not wrong. That's what I always admired about you. You played the long game. You were patient." I smiled, touched by her perception. "Not always by choice. Sometimes patience is thrust upon you by circumstance." I sipped my tea, the familiar blend, reminding me of afternoons with my mother, conversations where she had tried to impart wisdom I wasn't always ready to receive. But you know what? I've learned patience isn't passive. It's observant. It gathers information. It prepares. The woman who had once defined herself as Richard's wife and Sophia's mother had discovered a new identity: mentor, business owner, advocate for women's financial independence. The cream-colored envelope I had handed Richard at Sophia's graduation luncheon hadn't just been my escape plan from a marriage built on shifting sand. It had been the key to a door I never knew existed. Behind it I had found not just revenge, but reinvention. In securing my financial future, I had also reclaimed something far more valuable: myself. The self I had set aside to support Richard's dreams, to raise Sophia, to maintain our social standing in Augusta's traditional circles. The self with ambitions and capabilities that had waited patiently for their moment to emerge. That evening I attended a fundraiser for Augusta University's Women's Leadership Initiative, an organization I now served as a board member. The event was held at Riverwood Inn, the same venue where Richard had made his dramatic announcement 6 months earlier. As I entered the ballroom, now transformed with different lighting and decor, I felt a momentary echo of that day's shock and humiliation. But it passed quickly, replaced by the warm greetings of colleagues and friends, many of them clients who had become advocates for my services. The woman who had walked out of this room in June was not the same woman who walked confidently through it, now accepting congratulations for the scholarship program I had established for female finance students at the university. Later, as I drove home to the house that was now unquestionably mine alone, redecorated to reflect my preferences rather than compromises with Richard's more modern aesthetic, I reflected on the journey of the past 6 months. The woman who had once allowed herself to be humiliated publicly by her husband's announcement had found her voice, her purpose, and her power. The calculated heart that Richard had once dismissed as a weakness. Victoria trusts me completely. That's her weakness, had proved to be my greatest strength. The ability to plan methodically, to observe patiently, to act decisively when the moment arrived. The financial acumen I had applied to our family's needs for decades was now serving dozens of women at crucial points in their lives. As I parked in the circular driveway of the Greek revival that had witnessed both the happiest and most painful moments of my marriage, I felt a sense of completion rather than loss. The path forward was mine, to determine the decisions mine alone to make. The future stretched before me, not as an uncertainty to fear, but as a canvas, waiting for my design measured deliberate and entirely my own. The conference room buzzed with chatter like a beehive at peak production, the sound of expensive shoes against marble floors mingling with the clink of water glasses and the rustle of presentation materials. Sunlight streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows, catching on the silver and glass accents throughout the sleek Manhattan office. I glanced down at my phone as it vibrated against the polished mahogany table, the screen illuminating with an incoming call from Adrian. The bright display contrasted sharply with the subtle amber lighting of the room, designed specifically to create an atmosphere of understated luxury for potential investors. "Excuse me, I need to take this," I whispered to Jonathan, our firm's managing director, who nodded slightly as he continued his pitch to the Tokyo delegation. I slipped out into the hallway, expecting the usual perfunctory check-in. "How's the presentation going? When will you be home?" Instead, Adrian's voice came through with a coldness that made my skin prickle despite the building's carefully regulated temperature. "I'm divorcing you," he said, his tone almost triumphant, like he'd just announced winning a competitive bid. "I've already sold the apartment, so you'll need to figure out where you're going to live. Enjoy that." For a moment, I couldn't breathe. The elegant hallway with its abstract paintings and strategically placed lighting suddenly seemed to contract around me. The audacity of it, the complete lack of remorse, the cavalier way he'd tossed our 6 years of marriage aside like expired produce. It was almost laughable. My hand tightened around the phone as his words sunk in my knuckles, whitening against the sleek black case. "You sold the apartment?" I asked, keeping my voice steady, aware of the interns passing by with curious glances. "Yeah," he said with a dry laugh that reminded me of ice cracking underfoot. "Sophia and I need the money to set up our life together. She deserves better than a tiny place like that anyway." Sophia. The name stung like antiseptic on an open wound, though I'd suspected for months that there was someone else. Adrian's late nights at his architecture firm, his sudden international conferences that never seemed to produce any new designs, and the mounting distance between us all pointed to a third party. But to hear him speak her name so casually, as if I were the intruder in their life, lit a fire in my chest that threatened to consume the professional composure I'd spent years perfecting. "Sounds good," I replied evenly, nodding politely at a colleague who passed by with a questioning look. There was no way I was giving him the satisfaction of hearing me crack. My name is Elena Castillo, and up until that phone call, I thought I'd married a man I could trust with both my heart and my future. Adrian and I had been together for 6 years, and while things hadn't always been perfect, his artistic temperament often clashing with my analytical nature, I'd believed in our partnership in the vows we'd exchanged on that windswept beach in Montauk 4 years ago. We'd worked hard to buy our apartment a cozy 2-bedroom in Gramercy Park, with original crown molding and bay windows that bathed the living room in golden light. During the late afternoon, I'd fallen in love with it, the moment I saw the built-in bookshelves and the kitchen's blue tile backsplash that reminded me of my grandmother's home in Barcelona. It wasn't just a home. It was a symbol of everything we'd built together, the foundation for the family we'd talked about starting. Or at least that's what I'd thought. Looking back, there had been signs, small cracks in the foundation. I'd ignored Adrian's dismissive attitude whenever I asked about finances, the way his eyes would slide away from mine when I mentioned our joint savings account. His tendency to brush off my concerns with a charming smile and a quick kiss that always tasted faintly of the expensive scotch he'd developed a taste for. Once his firm started landing larger contracts, I'd always assumed his confidence came from knowing what he was doing. Now I realized it came from knowing he could manipulate me. I've already started moving my things out. Adrian continued oblivious to, or simply uncaring about the shocked silence on my end. I'll grab the rest while you're still in New York. I think that's easiest for everyone, don't you? Of course, I replied, my voice distant to my own ears. Very considerate of you. Great, he said, relief evident in his voice. Well, I should go. Sophia's waiting. Good luck with the Tokyo deal. The call ended before I could respond, leaving me standing in the hallway clutching my phone. My reflection fractured across the mirrored wall opposite me. A 34-year-old woman in a tailored navy suit. Dark hair pulled back in a sleek chignon Mediterranean, complexion pale with shock. The rest of the day passed in a blur of presentations, handshakes, and practiced smiles. I sat through client meetings nodding at all the right moments, while my mind raced through calculations and contingencies. The irony wasn't lost on me that, while I was negotiating a multi-million-dollar real estate investment deal for overseas clients, my own husband had allegedly sold our home out from under me. Adrian thought he'd won. He thought he could pull the rug out from under me, sell the home I'd worked so hard for, and walk away, scot-free with his new girlfriend, to some glamorous future funded by my loss. But there was one crucial detail he didn't know. The apartment deed had been in my name alone for months. I'd had it transferred after we refinanced earlier in the year, a move Adrian had agreed to without much thought, because it meant a lower interest rate and freed up cash for the vintage Porsche he'd convinced himself was essential to projecting the right image to clients. He'd never bothered to ask about the details or read the paperwork he'd signed. His attention focused on the car brochures laid out next to the mortgage documents. His carelessness was going to be his undoing. By the time I returned to my hotel room that evening, the plush comfort of the peninsula, feeling at odds with the turmoil in my mind, my shock had turned into resolve. I stepped out of my heels, releasing a sigh, as my feet pressed against the soft carpet, and poured myself a measure of Macallan from the minibar. The amber liquid caught the light as I swirled it in the crystal tumbler, its warmth spreading through my chest as I took a sip. I wasn't going to cry or beg. Adrian wanted a fight. Fine, but this was a fight. I was going to win, and I was going to do it with the same strategic precision I brought to every business deal I closed. The first call I made was to Rebecca Chen, my lawyer and Harvard Law classmate. I laid out the situation in painstaking detail, my voice calm even as my pulse raced beneath the silk of my blouse. He sold the apartment. She repeated, incredulous. I could picture her in her office, across town, sleek black hair falling forward as she leaned into the phone. Her collection of origami cranes, one for each case, one catching the late afternoon sun, on the shelf behind her desk. Does he even realize that he can't do that without your consent? Apparently not. I said, a hint of amusement creeping into my tone as I refilled my glass. He thinks he's already spent the money on his new life with Sophia. Rebecca laughed dryly, the sound of shuffling papers coming through the line. Well, he's in for a rude awakening. The sale is invalid. You can prove sole ownership, and if he's taken any money from the buyer, he's on the hook for fraud. The word fraud sent a jolt of satisfaction through me, sharp and clarifying like the first sip of espresso in the morning. What do we need to do? I asked, already reaching for the hotel stationery to take notes. First, we'll notify the buyer that the Sale isn't legal. Rebecca said, her tone shifting to what I thought of as her battle mode. Then we'll draft a formal letter for Adrian outlining the consequences of his actions. If he's dumb enough to try anything else, we'll take him to court and make sure he regrets ever thinking he could outsmart you. As I hung up, I felt a strange sense of calmness settle over me. Adrian thought he'd caught me off guard, that he'd left me powerless and scrambling. But in reality, he'd just set himself up for the ultimate humiliation, one that would be witnessed not just by me, but by the social and professional circles he was so desperate to impress. I spent the rest of the trip focusing on my work, compartmentalizing my emotions, and channeling my energy into securing the Tokyo deal. The betrayal hurt a persistent ache beneath my ribs that intensified in the quiet moments before sleep. But the prospect of reclaiming my life and watching Adrian's smugness crumble gave me a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in months. When I boarded the plane home, the weight of the signed contracts in my briefcase, a pleasant reminder of my professional success. I was ready to face Adrian, ready to dismantle his lies, and ready to start a new chapter without him. This wasn't just about winning. It was about taking back control. The flight from New York to Boston gave me 3 uninterrupted hours to think about how everything had unraveled. I ordered a glass of Pinot Noir and stared out the window at the cloudscape below, remembering how Adrian and I had met at a gallery opening in Soho. He'd been charming then, his dark eyes crinkling at the corners, when he laughed, his passion for design evident in the way he described the architectural elements of the converted warehouse space. I'd been captivated by his enthusiasm, the way he saw beauty in structures and spaces that others overlooked. But somewhere along the way, that passion had twisted into something else. An obsession with appearances, with status, with being seen as successful, regardless of the reality. Adrian's arrogance was astounding. He hadn't even tried to hide his betrayal, as if I was just another obstacle to bulldoze on his path to the life he felt entitled to. But instead of spiraling into anger, I focused on what I'd do when I returned. Adrian thought I was powerless, but he didn't realize I'd been playing the long game without even knowing it. As the plane touched down at Logan, the familiar skyline of Boston, visible through breaks in the low-hanging clouds, my first call was to Rebecca. "I'm back!" I said as I hauled my Rimowa suitcase off the luggage carousel, its wheels gliding smoothly across the polished terminal floor. "What's the next step? We've already notified the buyer." She replied, her tone brisk and efficient. They were shocked, to say the least, and not too happy with Adrian. They're willing to cooperate, which helps our case significantly. "And Adrian?" I asked, nodding thanks to the driver who opened the car door for me, outside the terminal. The crisp autumn air a welcome change from the recycled atmosphere of the plane. I sent the formal letter to his email this morning. She said, "It outlines the illegality of the sale, your sole ownership of the apartment, and the potential consequences of fraud." He hasn't responded yet, but if I had to guess, he's going to be furious. Good, I thought, settling into the back seat of the town car. Let him stew. The drive from Logan to Gramercy took longer than usual. Traffic clogging the streets as an early October rain began to fall. Droplets racing each other down the windows like tears I refused to shed. When I arrived home, the apartment was eerily quiet. Adrian's things were still there. His collection of architectural magazines fanned out on the coffee table. His expensive jackets draped over the chair in the bedroom. His shoes carelessly tossed by the door. But the place felt different, like the energy had shifted. I took a deep breath and set my suitcase down, the scent of the eucalyptus diffuser I'd bought last month, still perfuming the air, though fainter now. Running my fingers along the spines of our books, his sleek art volumes, interspersed with my dog-eared classics, I realized how much of ourselves we'd poured into this space. The thought of him trying to sell it without a second thought made the anger I'd been suppressing flare up again, hot and bright, behind my sternum. I unpacked methodically, placing my clothes back in the closet that was now half empty, Adrian's tailored suits conspicuously absent. In the bathroom, his electronic toothbrush was gone, along with his collection of artisanal shaving products that had always cluttered the marble counter. It was as if he'd extracted himself piece by piece, taking only what mattered to him and leaving the ghost of our life together behind. The confrontation would come soon enough. For now I showered away the stale air of travel, changed into comfortable leggings and a soft cashmere sweater, and opened a bottle of the Barolo we'd bought during our trip to Piedmont last year. The wine was rich and complex, with notes of cherry and tobacco that unfolded slowly on the palate. I savored it as I stood at the window watching the rain transform the city into a blur of lights and reflections. Sure enough, Adrian came storming in that evening, entering without knocking, as if he still belonged there. His tall frame seemed to fill the entryway, his expensive cologne stronger than he used to wear it, as if compensating for something preceding him into the room. His face was flushed with anger, his usually styled hair disheveled as if he'd been running his hands through it repeatedly. He held his phone in one hand, the screen still illuminated with Rebecca's email. "What the hell is this?" he shouted, waving the device as if it were the offending party rather than himself. "You're telling me I can't sell the apartment, it's half mine." I remained seated at the dining table deliberately, taking another sip of wine before responding. The calm in my voice surprised even me. "No, Adrian," I said, setting the glass down on the polished wood surface. "It's not. The deed has been in my name since the refinance. You can't sell something you don't own. He froze, his expression shifting from righteous indignation to confusion, like a man who had suddenly found himself speaking a language he didn't understand. "What are you talking about?" I stood slowly retrieving the deed from the file I'd pulled earlier, holding it up for him to see. The official seal caught the light from the pendant lamp overhead, a tangible symbol of my foresight. After we refinanced, I had the deed transferred to my name alone. You signed off on it, remember? Or did you just skim the paperwork like you always do, too busy dreaming about that ridiculous car to pay attention to the details? My voice remained level, but there was an edge to it now, sharp as the knife I'd used to slice lemons for cocktails at countless dinner parties where Adrian had charmed our friends while I did all the work. For a moment he said nothing. Then his expression twisted into a sneer, his handsome features rearranging themselves into something ugly and unfamiliar. "You think you're so smart, don't you? This doesn't change anything. I already made a deal and you're going to look like a fool when it all falls apart." I stared at him, seeing for the first time the stranger who had replaced the man I married. His dark eyes, once warm with passion and creativity, now held only cold calculation. The lines of his face, once expressive and animated, were now hardened into a mask of entitlement. "The sale is already void, Adrian," I said, maintaining eye contact, despite the urge to look away from this uncomfortable truth. "The buyer knows it, and they're ready to take legal action if you don't return the money. Oh, and speaking of money," I took a step closer, lowering my voice as if sharing a confidence. If you've spent a single cent of that deposit, you're in even bigger trouble. Adrian's confidence wavered for the first time since he'd entered the apartment. A flicker of doubt crossed his face, quickly masked, but unmistakable to someone who had studied his expressions for years. "You don't know what you're talking about," he muttered, avoiding my gaze, his fingers tightening around his phone until the knuckles blanched white. "Oh, I know exactly what I'm talking about," I said, my voice steady as I moved to stand directly before him. "You've spent years treating me like I'm too naive to notice what you're doing, too focused on my career to see yours floundering, too trusting to question where you really were on all those business trips. But guess what, Adrian? I've been paying attention, and now you're going to deal with the consequences." He started pacing his Italian leather shoes, leaving damp marks on the hardwood floor from the rain outside. His frustration mounted visibly like pressure, building in a sealed container. "This is ridiculous. You're blowing everything out of proportion. You can't just kick me out of here." I raised an eyebrow, allowing myself the smallest smile. "Actually, I can. This apartment is legally mine. You can stay here for now, but only because I'm giving you the courtesy of time to figure out your next move. But let me be clear, I'm not going anywhere." Adrian stopped pacing, his expression shifting again this time, to something closer to the charm he'd once wielded so effectively. "Elena, come on. We can work this out. You're upset, I get it. I didn't handle things well, but we can find a solution that works for both of us." The sudden change in tactics was so transparent it was almost insulting. "There's nothing to work out," I replied, moving past him to open the front door. "You made your choice, and now I've made mine. I'm going to bed. Lock up when you leave." I walked to the bedroom and closed the door behind me, listening as Adrian continued to stand in the living room, his breathing audible even through the solid wood. Eventually, I heard the front door open and close, followed by silence. Only then did I allow my composure to crack a single tear tracking down my cheek before I wiped it away, squared my shoulders, and began preparing for the battle ahead. Over the next few days, Adrian's anger turned into desperation. He called me repeatedly, leaving frantic voicemails that alternated between begging and threatening. "You're making a huge mistake." One began, his voice slurring slightly, as if he'd been drinking. "I have friends at every major firm in the city. One word from me, and your career is over." Another took a different approach. "Elena, please, I messed up, I know that. Can't we at least talk about it? We built a life together. That has to count for something." Meanwhile, Rebecca worked behind the scenes with ruthless efficiency to ensure that every loose end was tied up. The buyer, a tech executive who'd been planning to use our apartment as a pied-à-terre, rescinded the agreement, furious at Adrian for wasting their time and money. Rebecca drafted the preliminary paperwork for the divorce proceedings, her attention to detail ensuring that Adrian would have no wiggle room. "You're in a good position, Elena," she told me during one of our meetings in her corner office with its panoramic view of the Boston skyline, glass and steel gleaming in the autumn sunshine. "Adrian has no leverage here. Between the voided sale and the fraud charges hanging over his head, he'll have to cooperate if he wants to avoid a bigger mess." Her words were a relief, but they also reminded me just how much I'd allowed Adrian to control. During our marriage, for years I'd ignored his dismissiveness and arrogance, telling myself it wasn't worth the fight, that relationships required compromise, that his ego was fragile because of his artistic temperament. But now I saw how much I'd been giving up, and I was determined to take it all back. Not just the apartment, but my autonomy, my self-respect, and my future. Olivia, my best friend since our undergraduate days at Smith College, came over one evening to help me reorganize the apartment. We boxed up Adrian's remaining things, carefully stacking them in the corner of the living room. His design awards the collection of first edition architecture books. He'd spent years accumulating the hand-blown glass sculptures from his favorite Venetian artist, all packed away, with a care they perhaps didn't deserve. "How's he taking all this?" Olivia asked, holding up one of Adrian's gaudy silk ties, with a smirk, the fabric shimmering under the recessed lighting. She'd never fully warmed to him, her innate skepticism picking up on his insincerity long before I'd been willing to acknowledge it. "Not well," I said, laughing despite myself as I wrapped another of his pretentious art pieces in bubble wrap. "He's still convinced he can talk his way out of it, but I'm not budging." "Good," she said, tossing the tie into the box with less care than I'd been showing. "He doesn't deserve a single inch of your space or your time." She paused, tucking a strand of her curly auburn hair behind her ear. "Have you heard anything more about the girlfriend?" I shook my head, the question bringing a fresh wave of hurt that I quickly suppressed. "Not really. Just that her name is Sophia, and apparently our place wasn't good enough for her." I gestured around at the carefully curated space with its herringbone floors and custom millwork. "Guess her tastes run more toward the penthouse level." Olivia rolled her eyes, her freckled face conveying exactly what she thought of Sophia's standards. "Well, she's welcome to him and all his debt." I looked up sharply. "What do you mean?" Olivia froze, her expression shifting to one of hesitant caution. "I thought you knew. Marcus mentioned it the other night. He and Adrian were at the same bar. Adrian was pretty drunk, complaining about cash flow problems at his firm. Something about a project that fell through and investors pulling out. The revelation landed like a stone in still water, sending ripples of understanding through my consciousness. Suddenly, so much made sense. Adrian's increased anxiety about finances, his desperate push to refinance the apartment, his eagerness to secure a quick sale. It wasn't just about leaving me for Sophia. It was about extracting himself from financial troubles I knew nothing about. "That explains a lot," I said quietly, setting down the crystal paperweight I'd been about to wrap. "He wasn't just leaving me. He was using me." Olivia moved to sit beside me on the couch, her hand warm on my shoulder. "I'm sorry, Elena. I thought you knew." I shook my head, a strange calm settling over me as another piece of the puzzle clicked into place. "Don't be. It just confirms I'm making the right decision." I stood, newfound energy coursing through me. "Let's finish packing his things. I want them out of here by tomorrow." For so long I'd felt alone in my marriage, carrying the emotional and financial burden, while Adrian took credit for everything. From the apartment purchase to our social connections to the stability my income provided. But now I had people in my corner, and that made all the difference. The final piece of my plan fell into place the day Adrian brought Sophia to the apartment, clearly expecting to find me at work. I'd taken the day off a rare indulgence that was now proving invaluable. I was sitting at the dining table reviewing some investment prospectuses when they walked in like they owned the place. The look of shock on their faces would have been comical if it weren't so infuriating. Sophia was younger than I expected, perhaps in her late 20s, with the kind of effortless beauty that comes from youth and expensive maintenance. Highlighted blonde hair falling in perfect waves, lash extensions framing blue eyes, widened in surprise. A figure showcased by designer jeans and a silk blouse that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. She looked around with a smug smile that faltered when she saw me. Her arm looped through Adrian's as if staking a claim. "So this is where we're staying," she said, her voice carrying a faint southern drawl that seemed at odds with her Manhattan polish. Her gaze swept over the apartment with the assessing eye of someone mentally redecorating, already erasing my presence from the space. I stood up, my heart pounding, but my resolve unshaken. "No," I said firmly, my voice carrying across the room. "This is where Adrian was staying. You, Sophia, won't be staying here at all." Her smile faltered, further confusion creasing her perfectly Botoxed forehead as she glanced at Adrian, who looked equally stunned by my presence and assertion. "What is this?" he demanded, his voice pitched higher than usual, a tell I recognized from the rare occasions when a client had rejected one of his designs. "This," I said, gesturing to the apartment around me. The space we'd painted together during that first summer, the kitchen where we'd cooked elaborate meals for friends, the living room where we'd argued and made up and planned our future, is my home. Not yours, not hers, and certainly not a hotel for you to shack up in after stabbing me in the back. Sophia's expression turned icy, but she said nothing, her eyes darting between Adrian and me as if trying to assess which of us held the real power in this situation. Adrian, on the other hand, looked like he was about to explode, a vein pulsing visibly at his temple. "You can't do this!" he shouted, his designer messenger bag dropping to the floor with a thud. "You're being unreasonable." I met his gaze, unflinching. "No, Adrian. What's unreasonable is thinking you could sell my home walk away with the money and expect me to just roll over. You're lucky I haven't filed criminal charges for now." Adrian stood in the doorway, his face reddening further, while Sophia crossed her arms, looking increasingly uncomfortable in her 4-inch heels and tight jeans. "You're being ridiculous, Elena," he said, his voice laced with desperation. "You can't just kick me out of my own home." I took a step forward, my voice calm but unwavering. "This is my home, Adrian. The deed has been in my name for months, and you know that. You signed the paperwork without even reading it, just like you always do when something more shiny catches your attention. So no, this isn't your home anymore." Sophia glanced at Adrian, her perfectly manicured hand tightening around her Chanel purse strap. "Wait, what's she talking about?" she asked, her tone sharp as cut crystal. "You said this was your apartment, that you sold it, and we were just picking up the last of your things." He flinched, trying to wave her off with a dismissive gesture. I'd seen countless times at dinner parties when someone questioned one of his more grandiose claims. "It's complicated, I'll handle it." "Oh, it's not complicated," I said, stepping closer, feeling a surge of confidence that had been missing from our interactions for too long. "You tried to sell an apartment that doesn't belong to you. That sale is void, Adrian, and as of right now, you don't have a leg to stand on. Legally or morally." Sophia's composure cracked like fine porcelain dropped on marble. "You mean the money you told me you had?" She stopped mid-sentence, her voice rising an octave. "Oh my God, did you lie about that too? What about the place in Tribeca you said we were looking at next week?" "Sophia, let me explain," Adrian said quickly, holding his hands up in a placating gesture that seemed pathetically inadequate given the circumstances. But she wasn't having it, her perfectly contoured face flushing with anger. "No," I said, cutting him off with a decisive gesture. "Let me explain." Adrian tried to sell the apartment behind my back, thinking he could pocket the money and leave me with nothing. What he didn't know is that I had the deed transferred to my name months ago, during refinancing. So not only did he fail to sell it, but he also committed fraud by pretending he could. Sophia's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air, her expensive lip gloss catching the light. Fraud! She whispered, taking a step away from Adrian, as if his problems might be contagious. Are you serious? Yes, fraud, I said, crossing my arms over my chest. And I'm prepared to press charges if he doesn't get his things and leave by the end of the day. The boxes are already packed. I gestured to the corner where Adrian's life had been neatly contained and labeled ready for removal. Adrian's facade finally cracked the urbane architect, giving way to something more desperate and raw. You can't do this, Elena, he said, his voice pleading. Now, we've been together for 6 years. We built this together. You can't just throw me out like yesterday's garbage. You threw me out the moment you made that phone call, I said, my voice hardening like cement setting. You told me you were divorcing me and laughed about me having to find a new place to live. You didn't just betray me, Adrian. You tried to ruin me. So don't stand there and act like you're the victim. Sophia took another step back, her eyes darting between us with growing alarm. This is insane! She muttered, clutching her purse tighter, as if it might protect her from the fallout. You didn't tell me any of this, Adrian. You said you had everything handled, that the money was already in your account. He turned to her, desperation written all over his face, like architectural plans gone wrong. Sophia, I can fix this. I just need a little time to sort things out. We can still... She cut him off with a raised hand, her bracelets jangling with the abrupt movement. Just don't. I'm not getting dragged into your mess. This is not what I signed up for. Without another word, she turned on her heel and stormed out the heavy front door, slamming behind her with a finality that echoed through the apartment. I couldn't help but smile as the sound reverberated through the suddenly silent space. Looks like you're on your own, I said, turning back to Adrian, whose confident posture had collapsed like a building with faulty foundation. Now let's talk about what happens next. He slumped onto the couch, the one we'd spent weeks selecting, visiting every high-end furniture store in the city before finding the perfect balance of comfort and style, and buried his face in his hands. The gesture might have moved me once, but now it just seemed like another performance in a long-running play. Elena, please, he said, his voice muffled by his palms. I screwed up, I know that, but you don't have to do this. We can work something out. You're right, I said, retrieving a folder from the kitchen counter and setting it on the coffee table in front of him with a decisive snap. I don't have to do this, but I'm going to... This is the divorce paperwork. Rebecca has already drafted it, and I suggest you sign it quickly. The sooner you do, the sooner we can both move on. He stared at the folder as if it might bite him, his face pale beneath the tan he maintained year-round, with regular visits to an exclusive salon. You really hate me that much? Hate you? I let out a bitter laugh, the sound harsh in the elegant space we'd once shared. No, Adrian, I don't hate you. I feel sorry for you. You had everything, someone who loved you, a home we've built together, a partnership that could have weathered any storm, and you threw it all away because you couldn't see past your own ego and ambition. I stood straightening the jacket of my suit with a practiced gesture armor against the vulnerability threatening to break through. I want you out of here by the end of the day. Take your things and figure out where you're going to stay. This is the last time I'm giving you any grace. He opened his mouth to argue, but stopped, his shoulders slumping in defeat like a marionette, whose strings had been cut. Fine, he muttered, reaching for the folder. I'll go. Good, I said, walking toward the door and pulling it open with more force than necessary. And don't even think about trying anything else. Rebecca's already handling everything, and the next time you cross a line, I won't hesitate to let the courts handle it. As I held the door, Adrian slowly stood grabbing his coat, the cashmere one I'd given him for his birthday. Last year now creased from being stuffed into one of the boxes. He didn't look at me as he walked out, his footsteps heavy with defeat. For a moment I felt a pang of sadness, not for him, but for the life we could have had if he'd been the man I thought he was. But that moment passed quickly, replaced by a sense of relief, so profound it was almost dizzying. I closed the door behind him, turning the deadbolt, with the new key I'd had made the day after returning from New York. The sound of the lock engaging was satisfying in its finality, a period at the end of a chapter I was ready to close. This was my home now, and no one, especially not Adrian, would take it away from me again. The silence in the apartment after Adrian left was deafening in its completeness, as if the space itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. For the first time in years, I felt like I could finally breathe without the weight of his expectations and disappointments pressing down on my chest. The apartment no longer felt heavy with his presence, his entitlement, or his lies. It was just me, the home I'd fought for, and the quiet realization that I had won not just against Adrian, but against every doubt I'd ever had about standing up for myself. I stood in the middle of the living room, taking in the spaces where his things had been. The wall that had displayed his architectural awards now bore only faint outlines on the paint. The corner where his drafting table had dominated the space was empty, making the room seem larger and more open. His oversized leather armchair, the sleek sound system he'd insisted on installing, despite the building's pre-war limitations, and the abstract sculptures he'd collected were all gone. The apartment looked cleaner, brighter, like it was shedding a skin to reveal something more authentic beneath it. I moved through each room, slowly reacquainting myself with the space as solely mine. In the kitchen, I opened a bottle of Veuve Clicquot I'd been saving for a special occasion, pouring myself a glass of the effervescent liquid that caught the light streaming through the windows. This was my celebration, quiet, personal, and deeply satisfying. Olivia came by that evening with takeout from our favorite Thai place on East 23rd Street and a box of pastries from the French bakery around the corner. She entered with her usual whirlwind energy, setting down bags of fragrant food on the counter before enveloping me in a tight hug that smelled of her signature Jo Malone perfume. "Is he really gone?" she asked, plopping down on the couch with a dramatic sigh after surveying the newly opened spaces in the apartment. "Gone and not coming back," I confirmed, bringing plates and utensils to the coffee table where we'd shared countless meals over the years. The ceramic dishes clinked softly against the wood, a comforting domestic sound in a space that was being redefined. I gave him until the end of the day to pack his things. He didn't argue. Olivia raised her glass of champagne, the bubbles catching the light from the table lamp beside her. 2 fresh starts and well-deserved victories. She said, her green eyes sparkling with genuine happiness for me. I clinked my glass against hers, feeling the weight of the past week slowly lifting from my shoulders, like fog burning off in morning sunlight, to never letting someone walk all over me again. We ate and talked late into the evening, Olivia's presence filling the apartment with laughter and warmth that had been missing for too long. She'd been there through everything, From our first apartment hunt together after college, to the night Adrian had proposed at the rooftop restaurant where we'd celebrated my promotion to senior investment manager. She'd sensed his flaws long before I had, but had supported my decisions without judgment, waiting patiently for me to see what she'd always known. "What will you do with the place now?" she asked, twirling pad thai around her fork with practiced precision. "Keep it, sell it, rent it out and move somewhere new." I looked around at the apartment, seeing both the memories it held and the potential it offered. "I think I'll keep it, at least for now. It's still a good investment and I love this neighborhood, but I'm definitely redecorating. Everything will be exactly how I want it, not a compromise with anyone else's taste." Olivia grinned, reaching for her phone. "I've been saving design ideas for you for months. Don't tell me you couldn't see this coming." I laughed, the sound surprisingly light and genuine. "Show me everything." Over the next few days, I began to reclaim the apartment, piece by piece. I rearranged the furniture, moving my favorite reading chair to the spot by the window where Adrian's desk had been. I hung art that I loved, but he had dismissed as too conventional. A watercolor of Barcelona's Gothic quarter by a local artist I'd discovered on my last trip home to visit family. A black and white photograph of Boston Harbor at dawn that reminded me of weekend mornings rowing with the alumni crew team. I filled the space with things that made me happy. Fresh flowers from the market on Union Square, books pulled from shelves and placed within easy reach, the hand-woven throw my grandmother had made before she passed away. It wasn't just about redecorating. It was about turning the apartment into a reflection of who I was, not the person Adrian had tried to mold me into. Over the years, someone who valued image over substance, who prioritized appearances over comfort, who lived for others' approval rather than personal satisfaction. Rebecca called with updates on the legal proceedings, her voice filled with the kind of professional confidence that made me feel secure in my decisions. "The fraud charges are off the table since the buyer decided not to pursue them," she explained during one of our calls. "They were more interested in getting their deposit back quickly than engaging in a lengthy legal battle. But the divorce paperwork is moving along smoothly. Once Adrian signs, you'll be officially free." Hearing the word "free" made my chest tighten with an emotion I couldn't immediately identify. It wasn't just about the divorce. It was about everything I'd been carrying for years. The resentment that had built up like sediment in a riverbed. The self-doubt that had clouded my judgment. The feeling of being trapped in a marriage that didn't value my contributions or respect my autonomy. It was all finally being lifted, leaving room for something new to grow in its place. Adrian tried to reach out a few times. His messages ranged from half-hearted apologies to pathetic attempts to guilt me into reconciliation. I made a mistake. One read the timestamp indicating it had been sent at 2 a.m., probably after a night of drinking. "Can't we at least talk about this in person? You owe me that much." Another was more desperate. "You're going to ruin me, Elena. Is that what you want to destroy? Everything I've worked for. My reputation in this industry is everything." The irony of his concern for his professional standing when he'd been perfectly willing to sacrifice mine wasn't lost on me. I didn't reply. For once, I wasn't going to waste my energy trying to fix something that was broken beyond repair. He'd made his choices calculating and cold, and now he was dealing with the consequences, not just of losing me, but of losing the financial stability and social credibility that my family name and professional success had lent him. By the end of the week, the apartment felt like a completely new space, warm, inviting, and entirely mine. The scent of fresh paint lingered in the air. The bedroom walls now a soothing sage green rather than the stark white Adrian had insisted upon. New linens in soft textures and subtle patterns replaced the minimalist bedding he'd preferred. The kitchen shelves displayed the colorful ceramics I'd collected from various travels pieces he'd hidden away in cabinets, deeming them too informal for display. As I sat on the couch with a cup of Earl Grey, the city lights twinkling outside the window like earthbound stars, I thought about everything that had happened. Adrian's betrayal had been a shock, the kind of seismic event that reshapes the landscape of a life. But it had also been a wake-up call. For too long I'd let myself believe that I needed to accommodate his vision, that my preferences were somehow less valid, that I had to settle for whatever scraps of respect and love he decided to throw my way. But now I knew better. I wasn't just reclaiming my apartment. I was reclaiming my life, my voice, and my right to prioritize my own happiness. A month later, my life looked completely different. The apartment was unrecognizable, not because of any drastic renovation, but because of how it felt. It was a space that reflected me, my tastes, my personality, and my newfound independence. The absence of Adrian's controlling presence and endless criticism made the home feel lighter, freer, as if the very air circulated more easily without his ego taking up so much space. The divorce was moving along smoothly. Rebecca had handled everything with tactical precision, ensuring Adrian had no room to argue or complicate the process. He signed the papers without much fuss, likely realizing that he had no leverage and that fighting would only expose his financial troubles to greater scrutiny. There was no grand showdown, no emotional plea to work things out, just a cold, clean break that felt both bittersweet and deeply satisfying. Work became a renewed source of joy and fulfillment. The Tokyo deal had cemented my reputation at the firm, leading to a promotion that came with a corner office overlooking the harbor and a substantial raise. The irony wasn't lost on me that while Adrian's career was floundering under the weight of his poor decisions and burned bridges, mine was flourishing in ways I might never have allowed myself to pursue if still constrained by his insecurities. One day, as I sorted through some old papers in the home office I'd created from what had been our guest room, I came across a photo of Adrian and me from our early years together. It had been taken at a friend's wedding in the Berkshires, the autumn foliage, creating a spectacular backdrop for our smiling faces. We were wrapped around each other, eyes bright with promise, full of hope for the future we'd build together. I stared at it for a moment, letting the memories wash over me like waves on a shore. The genuine laughter we'd shared in those early days, the excitement of discovering each other's worlds, the way his hand felt in mine as we walked through snowy Boston streets. There had been good times, moments when I truly believed we were building something lasting and meaningful. But those moments had gradually been overshadowed by Adrian's growing narcissism, his dismissiveness, his constant need to position himself as superior while diminishing my accomplishments. I tucked the photo into an envelope and put it away in a drawer. It wasn't worth keeping out in the open, a shrine to something that had proven hollow, but I wasn't ready to throw it away either. It was a part of my past, a chapter in the story of how I became who I am. But it didn't define me anymore. Olivia and I celebrated the finalized divorce with dinner and drinks at a trendy rooftop bar in the Seaport District, the Boston skyline, providing a glittering backdrop as we toasted to new beginnings. The cool October air carried hints of the coming winter, but the heat lamps kept us comfortable as we worked our way through a selection of small plates and craft cocktails. "You're glowing," she said, raising her glass of elderflower martini in a toast. "Single life suits you." I laughed, feeling a warmth that had nothing to do with the alcohol and everything to do with the genuine happiness that had taken root in me since shedding the weight of my marriage. "It's not the single life," I said, taking a sip of my own drink. A smoky mezcal concoction with notes of citrus and chili. "It's the freedom. For the first time in years, I don't feel like I'm living under someone else's rules or trying to meet someone else's impossible standards." We toasted to that, and as the night went on, I felt a growing sense of pride in myself. I'd faced one of the hardest moments of my life, betrayal by the person I'd trusted most, and come out stronger, more certain of my worth. More committed to honoring my own needs and desires. I wasn't just surviving. I was thriving in ways I hadn't imagined possible. When Adrian had made that callous phone call just months ago. "Have you heard anything about him?" Olivia asked later as we shared a dessert that artfully combined chocolate sea salt and edible flowers. Marcus mentioned something about him leaving the city. I shook my head as surprised to realize I genuinely didn't care where Adrian had ended up. Nothing specific. Rebecca said something about him taking a teaching position somewhere in the Midwest. Apparently, his firm couldn't weather the financial difficulties, and the partners asked him to leave. Olivia raised an eyebrow. "And Sophia?" "Long gone from what I hear." Once she realized there was no money and no glamorous future, she moved on to greener pastures. I couldn't help but smile at the predictability of it all. They deserved each other, really. Well, here's to lessons learned and bullets dodged. Olivia said, raising her glass one final time. "And to the amazing woman who came out on top through it all. Back at home." I started planning for the future in ways I hadn't allowed myself to consider while with Adrian. The apartment had become more than a refuge. It was a symbol of everything I'd reclaimed and everything I stood to gain by trusting my own judgment. But I knew I wouldn't stay there forever. Someday I'd sell it and move to a place with no history of betrayal. Perhaps the brownstone in Back Bay I'd always admired, or the modern loft in the South End with floor-to-ceiling windows and a rooftop garden. Until then, I was determined to make the most of every moment in the space I had fought so hard to keep. I enrolled in a photography course I'd always wanted to take, joined a book club that met weekly at the independent bookstore around the corner, and even started dating again cautiously, on my own terms, without the pressure to find a replacement for what I'd lost. As I curled up on the couch that night with a new novel and a glass of wine, a sense of peace washed over me like a gentle tide. I thought about how Adrian had laughed during that phone call, so certain that he'd won, so confident in his power to destroy what we'd built together. And I couldn't help but smile at the cosmic justice of it all. His arrogance had been his downfall, his carelessness, the very thing that had saved me and my quiet strength, the weapon he never saw coming. This wasn't just the end of a marriage. It was the beginning of a new chapter. One where I called the shots, one where I chose happiness on my own terms, one where I recognized my own worth without needing anyone else's validation. And after a long time of feeling like I was playing a supporting role in my own life, I was finally gloriously the author of my own story.